local state. My name is Jason Sykin, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Alexis Rappo and Mike Jenkins. And we have a couple of special guests for this webinar. Chuck Holmes, the General Manager of WBHM, and Brian Sikora, the General Manager of UNC-TV in North Carolina. We're glad that you've all joined. We've got a very robust discussion on tap today about leading change and growth at your station with obviously a digital emphasis. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Mike Jenkins, who will walk us through what we've got on tap today. Mike?
Hey, everybody. So we'll start with just a quick review. So everybody who's been playing along with us, we finished the first two webinar sessions. Today's the May 1st, Leading Cultural Change. Then we've got a couple-week break while the PBS folks hit their annual meeting, and then we're back to talk digital strategy on the 15th. As always, with each session, there is take-home work and homework, so you should continue to refer back to the dca.qcatalyst.com for information on the sessions, catch up on past sessions, and review kind of the take-home work. Last week, webinar 2, this is kind of the highlights for anybody that missed it. Again, you'll want to go and catch up on your own if you happen to be out for that session, or if you want to pass it on to any of your coworkers to get them caught up so they can join us on the next webinar. That would be awesome. So last week we covered the Digital Culture Survey readout, which was where we had at the time 48 respondents. Good news, we're now up to just under 60 folks have completed the Digital Culture Survey. So as you kind of do that take-home work of doing the Digital Culture Survey at your own stations, as the group who's kind of generally taking it grows, it's like a nice way to kind of benchmark yourself against your peers. We also talked about the Discovery Framework, which is about the 100-page set of framework questions. That's a kind of more meaty exercise where the leadership team will need to get together, set aside time, as we discussed, to go through this framework as one step in kind of setting the stage for the work you'll do in the vein of culture change. And then the third and kind of final piece from last week was assessing your competition. And this was, generally about, even though you're buried in day-to-day work, from time to time, it's about, taking your head, lifting it up, and looking kind of externally, at the marketplace, everything that's happening, and then starting to look at your competition, and not just, the PBS or NPR stations that are in an overlap market, but start to look at everybody in your vicinity that is touching your consumer. So that was last week. And then a reminder, this is how you go and access the past webinars. So you go to dca.qcatalyst.com. You'll go down into the lower right quadrant where there's tools and resources. Click on webinar schedules. That'll pop up the previous week's webinar, and it'll have the homework listed in there, and then we'll actually have recordings of the previous weeks. You can actually watch the entire recording to get caught up or to do reviews. Before we kick off today's webinar, I want to do a quick little exercise to get people's fingers warmed up here. So if everybody could go up into the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there's a Q&A button. I'd like everybody to go and click that button because we're going to be doing a panel here shortly. And to make sure that everybody that's on the panel is involved, I want to make sure that everybody knows how to use the tool here to ask a question. So if everybody could click on that question mark, open up your QA box, and then type in something to the group there. So I see we're up to 27, almost 30 participants. If everybody could just type in the QA box, hello world, anything you want to send, just to make sure that, hey, it's working. Look at that. Perfect. So as we go into the panel, what I'll ask you to do is, if you have questions, go ahead and start to type them in there, and as the moderators, we'll go ahead and work through that list. So very good. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alexis.
Alexis, you might be muted.
So while Alexis is figuring that out, I'll just go ahead and continue here. So
Alexis,
again,
I think she's able to speak now. Alexis, try again.
Oh, can you hear me?
there you
Yes.
go.
Yep.
Go ahead. Start from
You
the
guys,
beginning.
okay, great. Thank you, Mark. So I wanted to jump into this conversation today. As Mike mentioned, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach. Today, this next section will be a panel section. Mike and I will take turns as sort of hosts and moderators of this conversation. We thought we would change up the format. You've heard, for those of us who have been in our first two sessions, you've heard us reference, I think, numerous times now, and also if you've read through the playbook, you've also heard us mention the pilot stations. And they were instrumental to helping us sort of test and sort of hopefully perfect aspects of this program. And they were also just great partners for the last year on this. And so we thought that bringing Chuck Holmes from WBHM and Brian Sikora from UNC-TV to actually talk through some of their experiences and talk through how they put the sort of program into practical action in their stations would be beneficial to all of you as you are diligently joining us each week and listening and going through this playbook. And we know from conversations we're having, the constant question is, why should I do this? How do I do this? So we hope that today will help to answer a couple of those questions and get to some specifics and let you hear from real-world people doing sort of this real-world accelerator within their stations. So with that, Mike, anything you wanted to add before I go on? Do you want to kick off this first question to Jason and the team?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and kick it off. Coming off our last session, we had talked about the digital culture survey, and these are kind of the updated numbers here. This question is to you, Jason. So when we look at these results, you have digital vision, digital strategy, having clear and measurable goals, the staff understanding how their work kind of aligns up to management. All those are, more than half, almost 3/4 of the audience. It's not clear. They don't have a clear vision, a clear strategy, measurable goals. So they're kind of lacking in all these areas. So when we talk about culture change, does leadership kind of need to get this stuff in order before they can do anything else?
So it's important to get these numbers up, but let me start by saying these numbers may look bad, but they're actually not at all surprising. I'd say 80%, 90% of the companies that we go into have very similar numbers like this to this, and that's both in public media and in the commercial sector. Most companies are still fairly early stage in terms of creating a digital vision and a digital strategy, and rolling that out and getting alignment throughout the entire organization around that vision and strategy. And there's a good reason for that. Most organizations are so busy running the day-to-day business that it's easy to put off the longer-term work of developing the vision and the strategy. The old cliche is to actually implement digital, particularly at a media company, it's like trying to fly the airplane at 40,000 feet and changing the engines while you're flying it in midair. And that's really, that's the conundrum, that's the dilemma that media companies face. So how do you address that dilemma? How do you carve out time to create a vision and create a strategy? Well, the good news is, the bad news is it's easy to procrastinate on that. It's easy to put it off. The good news is it's not hard to get started, and you don't have to create a perfect vision, or a perfect strategy to get started. What's important is to get the ball rolling.
Great, thanks. Chuck or Brian, any kind of comments around that before we move into the rest of the session?
This is Chuck. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I would just second that. I operate a much a fairly small organization that didn't have a lot of digital skills, and I think the biggest step was just getting in the game, and letting my staff know that it was okay to make mistakes, and finding a way to sort of manage our workload, and stop doing some things so that they could try a podcast, and so they could try to do some digital first reporting and those kinds of things. I think that's exactly right. Just kind of giving your staff the freedom to start doing things is important while you're figuring out the overall strategy. Obviously, we all have to lead, and we all have to come up with a strategy that our staffs can understand for the future. But sort of I don't think there's a need to wait to start sort of jumping in and doing things while you're doing that.
Chuck, it's Alexis. I think that's a great point. I remember the first time we sat down with you in Birmingham, and you had already had the workings of your sort of overall plan and your overall strategy just a few months into your time at WBHM. But I know through the course of the work that we did together that did evolve as you went. But you were starting with something. You had something to begin with the day we walked into the door before we ever started the program.
Yeah, thanks.
To that end, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Chuck. No, I was just going to say, I think you mentioned for the group, and I know this is something we hear from folks as well. Can you talk for a second about what your digital team was and what you were working with? Because again, I think part of what we hope to reveal today in some of these conversations too is that some things that people are struggling with are not so dissimilar from station to station or station size to station size. But you were operating overall with a pretty small staff and an even smaller digital staff.
Yes. We have about 20 employees, full-time and part-time, a 5-person news staff, and we had half a digital person. We had a 20-hour-a-week digital producer working for the station, and what I inherited when I arrived here in January 2017 was an office and a newsroom that kind of turned to this 20-hour-a-week employee who was doing web production and another consultant who was sort of doing our back-end web work and deferring almost everything digital to those two people who weren't really even full-time employees. And what I came in hoping to do, and the Q Catalyst team just reinforced that, was to convey to everyone that we all own this. This isn't something we need to wait around for somebody to do for us. We've got to be in the game, and we've got to go. And my staff was really receptive to that. They were a little afraid of the unknown, and they were a little afraid of getting out of their comfort zones. But by and large, they sort of embraced what it is we were trying to do, and the Q Catalyst team sort of helped us think through those things. I'll let you guys speak to how you approached WBHM in Birmingham. I think we all quickly realized that we didn't need to sit down and spend a whole lot of time developing strategy. There were some news events happening in Birmingham last year. There were some revenue needs of the station that we had facing us, and we very quickly dove right in with some sort of practical applications and some things we could try out to give the staff, one, something to do and try, and two, to sort of build their confidence level of, hey, look, I can do this, and this isn't so scary after all.
Chuck, you make some really good points, and particularly around the idea of diving in, even before your strategy or vision are fully baked. I think one of the things that you did brilliantly, and the other stations too, is that in lieu of having a fully baked strategy, it's important to set goals so that everyone in the organization, even if the strategy is still evolving, they understand what the goals are, be they in terms of audience growth or pledge growth or whatever. Can you or Brian speak to the goal setting piece of this?
I've been talking a lot. Brian, you want to take that one, or? you want me to weigh in?
Sure. Yeah. We kind of worked through, we were fortunate enough to be part of a Knight LenFest funded initiative with the Chapel Hill School of Journalism that kind of helped us sharpen our strategic plan and kind of our vision for transitioning from an internally focused traditional public TV station to an externally focused digital media publishing organization fueled by partnerships and inspired by data. And so that was kind of our overarching vision for the organization for 5-10 years down the road, maybe sooner, hopefully, but gave us kind of a sense of, what does it mean then to be a digital media publishing organization? And the first thing we realized is that we didn't really have our arms around the data. So before we set goals even, we realized that we needed to better aggregate the online audience, the on-air audience, the social audience, and all of those things that our content drives, and get a sense of that. But then we made some overarching goals around revenue increase, membership increase, engagement increase, like 2x our engagement. We also put some bogeys out there to just say, well, let's try to, increase our social media audience by 50%, our online giving revenue by 2x, which we were able to do, and just figured we'd pivot and move as things maybe didn't end up where they were, but you really had to create some sort of a goal to know when you would be successful. And so I think that was part of what this project helped us wrestle with. And to the earlier question about jumping in and having a strategy, I like if you say to somebody you need to have a digital strategy, it's like an elephant, right? It's like, wow, how do I start eating that sucker? And so we started with, well, we have a vision for what we want to be, but then let's have a Facebook strategy. Let's have an Instagram strategy. So we looked at audience segments as opposed to a digital strategy. It was an audience strategy that happened to live in the digital pool, but it just kind of helped us make it a little bit easier to digest as we work through that process. And then, the Q Catalyst team helped us kind of figure out why, ask hard questions like, why do you have 13 Facebook pages? Well, that's a great question, because we have 13 producers that all think they need to have their own Facebook page for their show because it's that important. But they only have 1,200 followers. And so if we know that 10% of the people of your followers actually interact with your content, that's getting to be small numbers. Let's aggregate that and post on a different schedule. So that helped us kind of wrap our head around, all right, what's a Facebook strategy and what's an Instagram strategy? And it just felt like it was a little easier to navigate than just saying, oh, now we need a digital strategy. So hope that helps.
That's great. And I think I've heard from both of you say in our course together, but also for the audience today, both of you did things with your organization maybe in a new way that hadn't necessarily been conveyed when it came to digital, was this kind of combination of inspiration and permission. Chuck, you mentioned, you were new at the organization, you were assessing the organization, and you had a moment of opportunity with what was happening in the sort of political sphere. And had you focused your attention on building strategies, you would have missed the opportunity to give your team that opportunity and that permission to say, let's not worry about strategy. Let's just try and get something done. So can both of you maybe sort of elaborate too, because I think it is a really important thing. I mean, there were permission, and how do you sort of grant that to your team and organize, and then sort of set that goal that they're moving to? How did that sort of manifest itself in change in your organization?
In Birmingham, it was a matter of I kind of got to a station that knew it needed to be in the digital sphere, both in terms of marketing and journalism, and was in it. They were doing some things, they were trying things, but they hadn't really embraced it. And it very much reminded me. I worked at NPR before I came to WBHM, and I got to my first job at NPR was in digital in 2009, and it very much reminded me of sort of the chasm at that time at NPR between digital and radio. People who did radio were really good at radio, and that was their comfort level. And it wasn't that they didn't necessarily want to do digital; it was that they didn't kind of quite know how or where to begin or what the parameters were. And so when I got here, I started out just writing a strategic plan for the station in general. And the opening line of our mission statement is, "We are more than a radio station." And that was intended for an external audience and an internal audience. It was intended for my employees. Listen, we've got to tell stories in different places. We've got to engage the audience in different places. And so as we had a pretty active political year last year. We had our typical, coordinated fund drive weeks coming up, and we approached almost everything that was in front of us as part of this pilot project as where do we apply digital? How do we do digital on this story? How do we do digital in terms of trying to engage the audience on our pledge pitch? And it really it ended up energizing the staff. We kind of saw the fear melt away in some people who had been reluctant up to that point, because again, we sort of created this space of, let's try it. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else, but let's at least give it a shot.
Hey, Chuck, we had a person from the audience ask a question. When you were talking earlier, you talked about folks starting digital, but in order to start digital, they had to stop doing something else. So how did you figure out what to stop? And how do you prioritize?
Yeah. So the first answer to that question, and I'll just to give an example, the station had never done a podcast or even attempted to do a podcast, and it wasn't for lack of wanting to do one. They just didn't feel like they had the time, and so we specifically started doing a couple of weekly standing features, on-air features, that in order to give one of our hosts time to go out and start a politics podcast, which actually really fit in well, because we had these standing features, and they were basically interviews with local print web journalists on certain topic areas, and they had gotten kind of old and stale, and basically these reporters were coming in and talking about whatever column they had written that week. And so we kind of let our host, rather than pre-tape those, go out and start doing this podcast. And guess what? Wow, we're creating our own unique content. We're telling the stories we want to tell. We're not just doing a two-way with reporters out in the community who happen to be telling stories. And so that's the specific example of what it is in the journalism realm we stopped doing in order to give our folks some capacity to do something else. Likewise, in marketing, we kind of relieved the burden on one of our membership engagement people and spread her workload to other people, so she could kind of concentrate on a social media strategy and an email strategy for our revenue efforts during fund drive, and kind of coordinate those in a better way, and keep the messaging coherent, on air, online, on social, and it worked out really well for us.
I'll also point out that there are some tools, including one that we mentioned in the playbook called the Business Model Canvas, which really help companies that we've worked with and other companies, help them prioritize and particularly do the hard work, help them do the hard work of figuring what to stop. It's oftentimes harder to identify what initiatives to stop. And the Business Model Canvas is a tool that helps organizations prioritize and not just new initiatives, but what they can weed out in order to free up people's time for those new initiatives. And I think a couple of stations, I know that Cleveland, that IdeaStream used the Business Model Canvas. I don't know if I can't remember Brian and Chuck. Did.
UNCTV used it too. Yep.
Yeah, we've been using that to even analyze things like our kids club. Like, what are we doing with our kids club? Is it a sustainable model? Who are our partners? And I think, back to the question about the question about how you how do you decide what to stop doing, and is that important? And I would say that's probably the most critical thing, is to have that conversation of what are we going to stop doing. We shut down 3 or 4 shows that have been collectively on air for 105 years. And so, they're no longer with us. Most of those are weekly shows, and it's funny, if you talk to your producers, there may be those producers that feel like it's they feel like it's their baby. And if you went and said, what would you do differently if you weren't producing this show? And might be surprised how many say, oh, I've been waiting for somebody to ask me that question for 20 years because I'm kind of burned out doing this show, boss. And so, that, and then I think Jason coming in, one of Jason's favorite phrases is fail fast. And for him to, kind of get that embedded in the psyche of the organization, I can't tell you how many times after this started that people come and say, hey, boss, fail fast. You can't be mad at me because Jason said that's what we're supposed to do. And, so that really helped. And I think, Chuck kind of alluded to that, getting your staff to understand that it's a culture shift. It really is, because for years they've been told to try to do, things right. And now you're saying, let's do the right things. And it's okay if they don't all work, but we're heading in the right direction. And that's a big shift in an industry that doesn't shift so well.
We had a question from Laura, and she was relating to an issue that you mentioned earlier of the multiple Facebook pages and creating alignment. Their issue is they have 10 plus Facebook pages and 10 different admins. And what were, as you did the assessment, as we did the assessment, sort of, can you just go back and just talk and elaborate a little bit more on what was the goal in condensing, and then how that actually happened in your station? Because I think you guys have seen success in taking that approach that might be beneficial.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is call Kevin Dando on the Q Catalyst team. He's brilliant at this. He's been doing it for years. And, I think it's an emotional thing, and that's what we saw at our organization, is that, people are emotionally attached to, the kids page or this page or this particular show. And the first step that really, shed a light on this is getting the actual numbers and getting, how many shares are there. And, Alexa, you can help me out here, what the metrics that you guys help us put together to analyze that, and then looking at the raw, kind of the industry specifics that say 8 to 10% of your followers are actually actively participating with your content. When you think 2,000 is a great number of followers, and you realize, holy mackerel, there's only 180 people that are really engaging with this stuff, it starts to change the conversation. And I don't think we really realized that. We really weren't up to speed on some of the industry issues. And then then part of the marketing is to the folks that are saying, there's only a couple hundred people that are engaging with your content, but we have 70,000 followers. And if we aggregate all these, we now have 100,000 followers, and 10,000 people now are going to probably interact with the content that we're creating, and we can elevate the quality of the posts and actually the quantity, so that on a more regular basis you're posting to Facebook. So it was a big shift here, and it really took the Q Catalyst, quite honest, it took kind of the ground cover from the Q Catalyst folks to give us the courage to do it and basically say to our team, look, I'm sorry, but the results are in, and here's what we're looking at, and it doesn't make sense anymore for the return on investment of your time. We also looked at that. We looked at how much time are we spending per staff member posting or creating content, and then you divide that by the interactions with that content, and all of a sudden the numbers don't look so good, that you're spending a lot of energy on something that really isn't creating as much engagement as you might have thought. So that was helpful, kind of putting it in a spreadsheet, in a kind of a chart. You can't really argue with the numbers when you start looking at them in a comparison fashion like that.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary. The one piece I would add is that one of the things that we often see when we see sort of multiple people running multiple channels is that you have multiple people with multiple objectives. And when you start looking at, and Brian brings up a great point on the ROI, when you start looking at the ROI that you're spending, what is the goal that everything's mapping back to for the station? And it is, and we talked a little bit about in some previous conversations about goal setting. And so if you've got a set of business goals for sort of overall strategy for your station, how do you ensure that as you're doing the assessment on each of these, that you're asking the questions of how each of these efforts maps back to the overall goal of the station? So you may have some sort of individual series goals, but ultimately, what are you trying to get that person to do on that particular social channel? And if you cannot all have sort of a shared voice and a shared understanding in terms of what you are expecting of these people, and most of the time when we have these conversations, it maps back to eventually moving them to a platform where you can capture an email address, where you can start to move them into a database, where there is more value built around that individual long term. Those are also the types of things that, as you're looking at the numbers, you also want to be asking, to what end are we managing all of these channels? And there should be a shared goal for each of those, which leads to, I think, generally the sort of the condensing and better management overall of your audience across platforms. Hope that answered that question.
I'll just add one thing quickly, which is anytime you're trying to push change creates emotion. Because people own something, and they, none of us likes change. It creates this unease and this emotion. And what tends to take the emotion out of the equation is data. And both Chuck and Brian have talked eloquently about their use of data and how data really helped them get over. I mean, it's nice of them to give us credit for giving them air cover, but what really gave them air cover, I think, was having the data at their fingertips to say, look at the amount of time that we're investing in these activities, and look at the payoff, look at the return on that investment. Wouldn't you rather put your work, put your time to something that's going to serve the American public, serve our audience in a more robust way? And everybody at work wants you want your work to have impact, and we see that it's reaching 3 people on Facebook. That's a pretty convincing piece of data.
This is Chuck Holmes again. It is a strong headwind, though. Here at we still have our terrestrial radio audience is still much larger than any other audience, and so you get staffers who sort of say, well, wait a minute, why am I doing this? And trying to convince people that you're doing it for the future. You're doing it because younger audiences and potentially bigger audiences await us in these places, and if we're not in the game, we're not in the game. And that's part of that's the process that's continued since Catalyst guys left. We have those conversations here almost every day as we try and sort of decide what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. But those legacy headwinds we're constantly walking against them.
Great. And I'm glad, Jason, that you reinforced the point around data, because we know that this is we saw moments in our pilots with each of these stations where, as everyone started to look at the data, it was sort of a centralizing point, and it sort of put everyone on equal footing. And as Jason says, it did remove the emotion. And I think that, Jason, this is sort of probably another question for you, and one best answered. We've talked today about the empowering of GMs, and yet the piece of that in these types of sort of change organizations is the ability for a GM to empower their team, but also to hold accountable. And that data is sort of one of the aspects that comes into the accountability. And we have also talked today about enabling staffers to be able to do so much more. But I think both Brian and Chuck, you have talked extensively about the empowerment that you brought in, the fail fast. Can you talk about how that continues today in your organization? Because while ultimately in a digital culture, everyone is a part of that change. We have talked extensively about making this is not about a silo. This is about an entire organization making change. But it has to come, our belief is it has to come from you. And it's not just at the start of the program, but it is sort of first and foremost a culture shift for the GM. And then can you talk a little bit about how this is a constant, and how this plays out constantly in your organization of continuing to push and empower and drive that within your teams today.
I was kind of hoping, Chuck. Go ahead, Chuck. You go first.
Okay. All right. This is Chuck in Birmingham. It's become part of every conversation we have here, which is a very good thing. Every editorial conference, every marketing revenue conference we have here, community of live events, community events. I've got the staff now talking about social strategy, email strategy. How do we publicize and engage communities of non-traditional audiences that we're not particularly involved in? We have more ideas than we have capacity for, but I view that as a very good thing, because I'm very encouraged that the staff is now thinking about these things and finding ways to do it in a very practical sense. We went out and hired, after Q Catalyst and our work with them, we went out and hired a couple of work-study college students here who were very socially media adept to work with our newsroom and marketing. We've turned one of those positions into a full-time digital marketing assistant position to help with that, because we needed capacity for all these great ideas that we were producing as a result of this. It's really shaped everything we talk about. I'm not going to pretend that we actually are able or have the capacity to act on everything that we would like to do or need to do, but I'm really encouraged that we're headed in the right direction, and we all seem to be singing from the same hymnal here in terms of not only looking at what we promote on radio, but how we do it digitally, not only talking about what kind of stories we tell on the radio, but what kind of treatment we give it on digital and how we do that better.
Yeah, this is Brian here. Sorry for the background noise. I'm in the car now. Kind of in the old category of put your money where your mouth is, and it sounds like Chuck has done that. How are you aligning your resources to continue to support the work that needs to be done? You can't just wave your arms and say to your folks, all right, now we're all going to be a digital media publishing company. Good luck. We hired a series of APs, associate producers, to work within we realigned our organization around content verticals. So we have an arts team, a science team, kids team, public affairs team, veterans team. So we have, but they didn't have kind of digital savvy on those teams, quite frankly, because some of them were the producers I took off of shows that we had on, traditionally over the last 10, 20 years. So they had the desire, but they really didn't have the skills. So you had to get some people within that team to really help them. And then we combined our social media engagement team with our fundraising team so that our online strategies became campaigns. It wasn't just the social team was off doing this and then the fundraising team was doing that. They became integrated. So, that's worked, probably not, that's worked almost too well because the social team, where we were hoping they would provide a little bit more support back to the content folks with some guidance. They're so busy raising money, they are struggling a little bit. So we're having our own challenges, but the staff knows that's where we're headed, and we're bringing resources in to help us get there. We're a long way from, quote, being there, but, I think that makes a difference of where you can make a few strategic investments, and the folks see that and they realize, hey, I might as well get on the bus because this is what the bus is being, repaired and fixed. So, terrible analogy, but hopefully you get the point.
Brian, do you or Chuck, do you continue to, how does data continue to play a part? Is that something that is a part of your regular meetings? Is that something, you said that digital is a part of everything now. Do you keep coming back to that sort of in the vein of encouragement and accountability? How do you keep everyone accountable on either the big, hairy goals you have set or the data goals you have set? How does that manifest itself? And does everyone understand kind of the marks that everyone's trying to hit? How does that work itself out?
Yeah, I'll go first on that one, Chuck.
Sure.
It's a process. we just reassigned somebody today to kind of help help us present the data. We're aggregating it. So we're all great at collecting data, but what is the information that we're able to derive from that? And so I wouldn't even say we're quite there yet with making really informed decisions. We've got the data now. We have a mindset of collecting the data, and we realize now that those are the building blocks. And now, what are we doing with it? I think we'll get there. And so, yes, it does inform the decisions, but almost right now it's a little bit too reactive. Like, this worked, that didn't work, as opposed to based on this, let's do that. And I think we'll get to that point, and occasionally we are, because we see what things resonate online and get shared. So we're starting to produce more of that, but you got to keep reinforcing that, where people will go back to doing what they were and saying, oh, what were our overnight ratings, or what was our Nielsen ratings? That's just a piece of the story now. That is not the total story.
Likewise, and I can't reinforce that anymore. Same experience here. We've actually in the process of kind of recreating a dashboard here, so that people aren't so focused on our Nielsen's, and that we're measuring social and digital engagement, both on our site and with our newsletter, so that we're looking at those numbers every week and sort of trying to figure out what worked and what hasn't. The podcast that I mentioned that we created last year, we're kind of re-examining that in terms of how we very happy with the content. We're wondering if we had the right sort of engagement strategy, and we've got a couple of other podcast ideas in the works. How would we engage audiences and promote those things differently next time around? Definitely a work in progress.
We have a couple of questions that have come in online. One is, and maybe Chuck or Brian, you could take this. One is regarding the fail fast mindset. What are some ways to make management comfortable with the faster concept to production to delivery than what PBS stations are historically used to? Which is a great question, because, and we face this all the time at various media companies. Media companies are very, we're all trained as journalists or as producers to produce something that's as perfect as possible, and then it goes out for broadcast, or it goes into the newspaper, and then it's done. Whereas in the digital world, it's much more iterative, and it's much more, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you keep improving it. So, Chuck or Brian, do you have any tips for other stations about how to speed up the production process?
Well, I'll go on the TV side, since that's what we do. That's a great question. And we actually have conversations around the building now, which are really great to hear. People are saying, why are we even talking about TV shows anymore? Why aren't we just talking about short segments that we put together? We do a weekend magazine show that tends to be 5-6 minute segments. Those were always done like the day the show aired. We put it on the air, and then we put some of the clips on the website, and it had marginal impact, or on Facebook. And now we get the show done a week in advance, and we've seen our TV audience up 15-20%. We've seen our social engagement up tenfold. And part of that process now is the guys are creating the stuff, and they're saying, I'm going to create a 3-minute web piece quick, get that up, and then I'll finish off my 5-minute segment once that's up. And now it's like they're racing to get things online, because they see the engagement with it. And the folks that we're featuring, because it's a weekend show, so it's about locations and festivals, and those people eat it up, and they get it out in advance. So I think giving your staff the opportunity to say, I'm just going to put together a down and dirty quick thing here, no voiceover, it's just going to have graphics on it, and we're going to put it up online and see what happens, and then, all right, then spend the next 2 days editing, your Final Cut version of that or whatever. So that's been helping a little bit. It's a little bit of a strategy. I hope that works. Very good.
Yeah, and for my radio station, it's tough, because capacity is a problem, and what it is we can do. We've had some success, and I feel encouraged kind of moving forward of leveraging our reporting across platforms, and the podcast has been a good example for my staff of that. Look, we can go out and produce a 45-minute podcast, and we can chop that up and use it elsewhere. We can use it on air. We can put audio clips on Facebook. We can leverage that, kind of across the board. It's tough because, and every newsroom in America and the world has dealt with this. You're asking people to do much more than they used to do in the same 8 or 10 hour day that they're working, and finding the capacity to do that, making sure they have the training and the skills to feel comfortable doing that. And we're still struggling with that.
Chuck, I wanted to come back around because you had some really amazing success. So back to this concept of taking a seize the moment approach to sort of really rally your team. Would you share with the group some of the sort of immediate results that you saw with your fund drive and how you basically took a lot of the training that we dove right into together with you and sort of strategy work and put that to immediate use? How did that, seizing the moment sort of play out for you from a success standpoint?
Right. So when I got here in early 2017 and talked to my marketing and membership folks, they had never in any kind of coordinated way used social or our email lists to seek revenue or to kind of coordinate with the pledge drive. And then after working with Q Catalyst through the summer with our fall drive coming up, we made a very deliberate strategy. We're gonna pick, our 4 main pitch points for the drive, and we're going to repeat them on air and online and on social and with email blasts to our newsletter list and see what happens. The reluctance to do this prior to this had been mainly from my marketing director, who was worried about backlash. He was worried that people would unsubscribe from the list. She was worried that we would be flooding people's Facebook feeds and they would be unhappy. And part of it again was just, let's try it. Let's see what happens. We had a $400,000 goal for our fall drive, and we raised about $100,000 of that through digital, through our, and I'm trying to remember the numbers exactly, but roughly $60,000 in kind of, we purchased Facebook ads, promoted Facebook ads, and then another $50,000 or so in targeted email. Now there's a Venn diagram there because we were reinforcing the on-air message and the digital message, and undoubtedly, because donors are procrastinators, as we got late into the drive, I'm sure people had heard our message on air and then finally clicked on Facebook to donate to us. But it was a spectacular success, and kind of just reinforced this notion here that, we can try these things, we can do these things and see how they work out, and we carry that forward. We did an end of year 2017 effort as well, and we just completed a spring drive about a month ago. Also had some pretty good numbers there, not as good as the fall numbers, but very encouraging in terms of that strategy of kind of pursuing revenue on all platforms and really coordinating the message on all platforms.
Thanks. And we were, for the folks on the call too, we were absolutely amazed at seeing the results that came out of Chuck's organization, to be able to increase that pledge donation by 33% over, was it an 8-day window?
Yeah, that's right.
And watching that be sort of one of the culminations of the team working for months and starting to collaborate and come together again, because of permission, because of, the permission to try something new and do something differently, but with a goal and with sort of structure and support and training behind them. You really showed in a very tangible way from a revenue standpoint what happens when those pieces start to come together. Jason, we've talked before in different settings about the risk of not starting to take on some of these attributes within your organization, and the risk to GMs of not really seriously taking hold of this idea of creating a more digital organization and sort of acknowledging the change and the disruption going on outside. From the work that we do with current clients and experiences that we've had elsewhere, can you just talk for a minute or two about what the risks are of not diving in, of not sort of putting that stake in the sand and really kind of understanding why the change is necessary?
Sure, and I think that Chuck and Brian have alluded to a lot of this already. But the tricky part of looking at digital is that in the short term, you don't really see the risks. Chuck said, yeah, we still have a lot more listeners on our terrestrial radio station than we do in digital. And I'm sure that's the case for Brian and most stations. So in the short run, you can delay doing a digital strategy, you can delay investing in digital, you can delay making the hard choices because it doesn't look like on a month-to-month or maybe even year-to-year basis that there's going to, for most stations, that there's an immediate threat. The problem is, of course, it's the frog in the pot of water syndrome, where you put the frog in the pot of water and you start turning up the heat. And eventually, the frog's fine because it's just getting warmer and warmer, but eventually it's boiling. And that's what happened to newspapers. I started in digital at the Washington Post in 1994, and it was a very similar mindset, which is, this digital thing it's increasing in importance, and they're draining away some of our ad revenue, but it's not going to change our lives over the next year. And then here we are, more than 20 years later, and we see what's happened in the newspaper industry, and that steamroller is bearing down on all industries, and the ones that the stations and other media companies that will not just survive but thrive, because I don't want to be too negative here. I actually think that digital opens up the opportunity for a real golden age of serving the American public with a lot of new tools and a lot of new ways to reach people. So I think the companies that not just survive but thrive and come out of digital change in a much better place are the ones that say, okay, short term, I know that this is hard, as Chuck and Brian have talked about. It's hard to get people to change, but if you stick with it, there's actually a huge payoff in terms of serving the American public and in terms of having a much better foundation for the future. So I think
it looks like we're down to about a few minutes left, so we probably have time for maybe one more question. We did have one come through the Q&A. This one's more of a tactical question, so maybe we'll skip this one, but try to I'll reach out to Justin, to you directly, to explain how tracking works digitally, to be able to know where funds are being driven from. And I'll also say that there's lots of things mentioned around social and the business model canvas, and when we look at all the future sessions that are coming, I would encourage everyone to attend those and to take a look at everything in the playbook, because we will do deep dives on all these areas and try to get down kind of to the nitty-gritty to help folks. But Alexis, was there any kind of final questions that you wanted to hit the panel with?
Yes. Yep, I had one final question for Brian and for Chuck. So on this call, we have a combination of GMs, but also people who are next level of leadership in the organization. I would ask you both to, if you were talking to the GMs right now, coming off this call, for people who are, looking at this course of leading cultural transformation, what's the one thing you'd sort of advise them, leave this call today and go talk to? What would be the one parting thought you would have for a GM? And I'm going to ask you about their leadership in a moment, so that's coming.
I'll go first. Go ahead,
please.
Brian. We're both being polite. I'll go first. This is Chuck. I think I know I'm kind of repeating myself here, but I would say it's giving your staff the confidence to fail, and conveying to your staff that there is no penalty for trying something new. That was I think the biggest obstacle here was getting people out of their comfort zone and making them know that here I was, the new manager in town, but I wasn't gonna fire anybody, and I wasn't gonna penalize anybody for trying something new. In fact, I was gonna reward you. I was gonna, even if it failed, I was gonna say good job, because that's where we needed to head.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, and then pick something tactical for an early win that people can look at. And the one that keeps coming to mind for me is we UNC-TV, you think it's a big organization, they're sophisticated. They weren't even collecting emails from pledge drives, right? And they didn't take any of the over-the-top emails. So all of a sudden, I just said to my staff, let's try to get let's get as many emails as we can. And we downloaded the stuff from the over-the-top that Jason had set up, years ago. And we had 150,000 emails. So, there's things you can do right away, and then you see your, digital fundraising taken off, and then the staff starts to rally around it and say, wow, this actually works. You can cut pledge and actually increase membership revenue because our online giving exceeded our on-air giving, So there's little things, too, to just have the courage to take that first step to get a win or two, and then people start to rally around you a little more. Not all of them, but some of them.
Thank you. And my last question for you both is, for the folks on this call who are not GMs but are in leadership, what would you have wanted to hear if this had not started at you at a GM level? What would have been the thing that you would have heard from someone in your organization that would have moved you to this place? What can the next level of leadership do to help move their GMs in this direction? What was your advice for them leading the call today?
That's a hard one. I was going to let Chuck go first on that one.
That is a hard one, because I come at this from Jason's perspective. I'm a newspaper refugee, and so I saw what failure to address the future looked like. I think so I think for a next level leader, if ultimately the question is, how do you manage up and get your boss thinking about this, or your peers thinking about this? It is that there's an urgency here that we may not think about as we're going about our daily business of putting on TV and radio shows. There's an urgency here that the landscape is changing, faster than we all know. I can't tell you how many people I hear from who are now listening to us on Alexa speakers and don't even own an FM radio anymore. Where are we going to be 5 years from now? That's why we have to change.
Yeah, and I guess I would love a staff member to come to me and show me an example of what another station's doing that's successful. I can't tell you how many times I snoop around, KQED's website to see what they're doing on digital, strategies. And, if somebody were to come to me with an idea and say, here's something that they're doing here, I've talked to the folks there, here's how they implemented it, here's the results, I think we got to give it a try. What do you think? I didn't really have a lot of that in my staff because I was relatively new, like Chuck, to the organization. I haven't been there 2 years yet. And that would have been great because it would have felt like it was coming from the bottom up a little more than from the top down.
Great. Well, we are so thankful, Brian and Chuck and Jason, for you guys joining and answering candidly today. I hope for everyone on the call this was really helpful. We will take questions here, and I know Mike's going to respond to a few people privately as well. And then if there are things that come up as you think about this conversation over the next day or two, feel free to use the feedback loop on the DCA.QCatalyst playbook site. I'm sorry, I always get the URL wrong. Mike, you'll get it right and can share with everyone. But please use that site to share any other questions, and we hope that this has been useful and helpful to everyone today. And thank you for joining, and thank you, CPB.
Yeah, and kind of final reminders before everyone jumps off. Your take-home work, and you have kind of 2 weeks between now and the next session to register for the next webinar. So we're at webinar number 4. Invite coworkers to join. As you'll see from, like today's session, there are opportunities to kind of drive home the points of the things that you'll read in the actual online playbook and hear it firsthand. So I think there's a lot of value in this. So the more folks in the system that we can get to join these sessions, the better. The next piece of your take-home work, we have a digital strategy prep worksheet that we'll be sending around via email and posting to the dca.qcatalyst.com website. And this is your kind of pre-work for the May 15th session, which is the digital strategy working session to help people, develop and refine and improve their digital strategies. And I would say that's valuable at all levels of the organization to just understand, how to go about developing strategy. And again, this is, we just finished week 3, so we're all well on our way. And then we're kind of on. Here's what the rest of the schedule looks like. And that's a wrap for today. So thank you all very much for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.